was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air feels fresh and cool against your skin. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across Washington Dulles International Airport. People bustled about, some rushing to catch their flights while others lingered near the gates, sipping coffee or scrolling through their phones. Among them was a man who looked like any other traveler, wearing a simple jacket, carrying a briefcase and holding a book tucked under his arm. He wasn't trying to stand out, but there was something quietly dignified about him, the way he carried himself with calm confidence. This man happened to be one of the most respected figures in the country, a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. But today he wasn't dressed in robes or surrounded by the usual trappings of power. Instead, he blended seamlessly into the crowd, just another passenger boarding a commercial flight headed for Chicago. His destination? A legal symposium where he was scheduled to deliver a keynote speech. No entourage, no security detail, just him and his thoughts as he prepared for the day ahead. As the boarding process began, the usual chaos unfolded. Families wrestled with strollers, business travelers adjusted ties while scrolling through emails, and flight attendants moved up and down the aisles ensuring everything ran smoothly. For the most part, it seemed like an ordinary flight. Passengers found their seats, stowed their bags, and settled in for the journey ahead. But then, something small, yet significant happened. As the justice reached his seat, he carefully placed his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. It fit snugly, though perhaps not perfectly. The edge of the bag jutted out ever so slightly into the aisle. Most people wouldn't have noticed, let alone cared. After all, airplanes are cramped spaces, and everyone knows you do the best you can with what little room you're given. Unfortunately, this minor oversight didn't escape the attention of one particular flight attendant. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an even sharper tone. To her credit, she'd been working nonstop for hours, dealing with everything from impatient passengers to last-minute gate changes. Stress had clearly taken its toll, and when she spotted the protruding bag, it became the final straw. "Excuse me," she said sharply, addressing the justice without hesitation. "That bag needs to go all the way in. You can't leave it sticking out like that." The justice turned to face her, his expression calm and polite. Without saying a word, he reached up and pushed the bag further into the compartment, making sure it was fully secured. Satisfied with his effort, he gave her a small nod and offered a quiet apology. "My apologies," he said softly. "I didn't realize it was sticking out." For most people, that would have been the end of the matter. Problem solved, no harm done. But the flight attendant wasn't ready to let it go. Her voice grew louder, cutting through the hum of conversation around them. "You need to pay attention," she snapped, her tone dripping with irritation. "We have rules for a reason. If everyone ignored them, we'd never get anywhere." The justice blinked, taken aback by the sudden escalation. He nodded again, keeping his composure. "Understood," he replied evenly. "Thank you for pointing it out." But the flight attendant pressed on, her frustration bubbling over. "Some people think they're above the rules," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Her words carried a subtle edge, one that made several heads turn. The justice froze for a moment, unsure whether he'd heard her correctly. Was she implying what he thought she was? Before he could respond, she gestured toward the overhead compartment again, this time more forcefully. "Make sure it's fixed," she insisted, her voice rising. "Now." Her demeanor shifted noticeably, her body language tense, her gestures exaggerated. When the justice hesitated briefly, perhaps caught off guard by her intensity, she took a step closer and shoved his arm lightly as if to emphasize her point. It wasn't a hard push, but it was enough to make him stumble slightly. The movement drew gasps from a few nearby passengers who were watching the exchange unfold. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The justice steadied himself, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He glanced at the flight attendant, then at the growing number of eyes now fixed on them. Despite the tension, he chose to remain composed. "I've already adjusted it," he said firmly but respectfully. "Is there anything else I can assist you with?" His calm response only seemed to fuel her anger. "You should have done it right the first time," she shot back, her tone laced with accusation. "Don't make excuses." By now, whispers rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. What started as a minor issue had spiraled into something far more charged. The flight attendant's behavior felt disproportionate, almost personal. And as the seconds ticked by, it became clear that this wasn't just about a bag anymore. It was about respect, authority, and how quickly things could escalate when patience wore thin. Unbeknownst to the flight attendant, the man standing before her wasn't just any passenger. Though she couldn't have known it at the time, her actions were being directed at someone whose life was dedicated to upholding fairness and justice. And while he might have chosen to handle the situation quietly, the wheels of accountability were already turning. Because unbeknownst to her, the justice had pulled out his phone during the confrontation and made a single call, one that would change the course of the entire flight. The tension in the cabin was palpable, like a storm cloud hovering just above everyone's heads. Passengers who had been minding their own business moments earlier were now fully tuned into the unfolding drama. Some craned their necks to get a better view, while others leaned over to whisper to their seatmates. The flight attendant's sharp words echoed through the narrow aisle, and her demeanor grew increasingly aggressive with each passing second. "You need to listen when I'm talking to you," she said, her voice louder now, almost shrill. She pointed a finger at the passenger, her movements sharp and deliberate. "I don't care who you think you are, but on this plane my rules matter." The man stood there, his expression calm despite the rising hostility. He adjusted his stance, slightly, as if preparing himself for whatever might come next. "I understand," he replied, his tone measured and respectful. "And I've already fixed the issue. Is there anything else I can do?" If anything, his composed response only seemed to irritate her further. Her face flushed red and her eyes narrowed. For a brief moment, it looked like she was struggling to find the right words, or maybe she was simply trying to regain control of the situation. But instead of backing down, she doubled down, her frustration spilling over into something uglier. "Don't act like you're doing me a favor," she snapped, her voice cutting through the quiet murmurs of the passengers around them. "People like you always think they're entitled to special treatment." The phrase hung in the air, heavy and loaded. Several passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether they'd heard correctly. The man blinked, his calm facade faltering ever so slightly. He tilted, his head studying her with an unreadable expression. Then, without raising his voice or losing his composure, he responded. "People like me," he repeated softly, his tone neutral but tinged with curiosity. "What exactly do you mean by that?" It was a simple question, one that demanded clarity. But the flight attendant didn't answer. Instead, she crossed her arms and let out an exasperated sigh, as if the entire exchange was beneath her. Her silence spoke volumes, though, and the passengers watching could sense the unspoken implication behind her words. It wasn't hard to read between the lines. The atmosphere shifted subtly but noticeably. A young woman seated nearby leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Did she really just say that?" she whispered to the man beside her. He nodded grimly, his lips pressed into a thin line. Around them, other passengers began murmuring among themselves, their voices low but urgent. One older gentleman shook his head disapprovingly. "That's not okay," he muttered under his breath. A mother sitting with her 2 kids shot the yo-yo flight attendant a glare before turning to comfort her wide-eyed daughter, who seemed confused by the sudden commotion. Even the children could tell something wasn't right. As the seconds ticked by, the flight attendant seemed to realize she'd gone too far. Her posture stiffened slightly, and she glanced around the cabin, perhaps noticing for the first time how many people were watching. But instead of apologizing or de-escalating the situation, she dug herself deeper. "This isn't personal," she said sharply, addressing no one in particular. "But we have protocols to follow, and I expect cooperation from everyone, including him." Her words fell flat, They sounded hollow, even defensive, as if she was trying to justify her behavior after the fact. The damage had already been done, though. The man standing in front of her remained silent for a moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The flight attendant didn't notice. She was too busy, scanning the cabin, her gaze darting from face to face as if searching for allies. But the passengers weren't on her side anymore. If anything, they were growing more sympathetic toward the man. After all, he hadn't raised his voice or acted aggressively. He'd simply tried to resolve the issue quietly and respectfully. Yet here he was, being berated in front of everyone. As the man dialed a number on his phone, another passenger, a young professional woman in a tailored blazer, leaned closer to her seatmate. "Do you know who that is?" she asked in a hushed tone, nodding discreetly toward the man. Her companion frowned, shaking his head. "No idea," he admitted. "Why? Should I?" The woman hesitated, then lowered her voice even further. I think he might be someone important. Like really important." Her comment caught the attention of those within earshot. A few people turned their heads, studying the man more closely. His clothes were plain, his demeanor unassuming, but there was something about the way he carried himself, an air of quiet authority, that made people wonder. One teenager seated near the window pulled out his phone and quickly typed a description into a search engine. Within moments, his eyes widened. "Oh my God," he whispered, nudging his friend. That's a Supreme Court justice." The revelation rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Passengers whispered excitedly to one another, piecing together the truth. Someone recognized him from news interviews. Another recalled seeing his picture online. The pieces clicked into place, and soon the mood shifted entirely. What had started as mild discomfort toward the flight attendant's behavior transformed into outright disbelief and anger. "How dare she talk to him like that?" A man in the row behind muttered angrily. "Doesn't she know who he is?" Others chimed in, their voices rising in indignation. "Even if she didn't know, that's no excuse," a woman added, shaking her head. "You don't treat anyone like that, period." The flight attendant finally noticed the change in the room. Her confidence wavered and she glanced around nervously, sensing that the tide had turned against her. But it was too late to backtrack now. The damage was done and the passengers were no longer willing to stay silent. Meanwhile, the man finished his call. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and turned his attention back to the flight attendant. His expression hadn't changed. He still looked calm, almost serene, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor. It was as if he knew that help was on the way and that justice would soon take its course. "I believe we're done here," he said evenly, his voice carrying just enough weight to command attention. "Thank you for your assistance." The flight attendant opened her mouth to respond but thought better of it. She took a step back, her arms falling limply to her sides. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked unsure of herself. The boldness that had fueled her earlier outburst had vanished, replaced by uncertainty and fear. Around them, the passengers continued to murmur, their voices filled with a mix of awe and outrage. Some recorded the scene on their phones, knowing instinctively that this moment would blow up online. Others simply stared, unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding before them. And then, as if on cue, the intercom crackled to life. A voice came over the speakers, crisp and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We'll be making an announcement shortly." It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air feels fresh and cool against your skin. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across Washington Dulles International Airport. People bustled about, some rushing to catch their flights while others lingered near the gates, sipping coffee or scrolling through their phones. Among them was a man who looked like any other traveler, wearing a simple jacket, carrying a briefcase and holding a book tucked under his arm. He wasn't trying to stand out, but there was something quietly dignified about him, the way he carried himself with calm confidence. This man happened to be one of the most respected figures in the country, a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. But today he wasn't dressed in robes or surrounded by the usual trappings of power. Instead, he blended seamlessly into the crowd, just another passenger boarding a commercial flight headed for Chicago. His destination? A legal symposium where he was scheduled to deliver a keynote speech. No entourage, no security detail, just him and his thoughts as he prepared for the day ahead. As the boarding process began, the usual chaos unfolded. Families wrestled with strollers, business travelers adjusted ties while scrolling through emails, and flight attendants moved up and down the aisles ensuring everything ran smoothly. For the most part, it seemed like an ordinary flight. Passengers found their seats, stowed their bags, and settled in for the journey ahead. But then, something small, yet significant happened. As the justice reached his seat, he carefully placed his carry-on bag in the overhead compartment. It fit snugly, though perhaps not perfectly. The edge of the bag jutted out ever so slightly into the aisle. Most people wouldn't have noticed, let alone cared. After all, airplanes are cramped spaces, and everyone knows you do the best you can with what little room you're given. Unfortunately, this minor oversight didn't escape the attention of one particular flight attendant. She was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an even sharper tone. To her credit, she'd been working nonstop for hours, dealing with everything from impatient passengers to last-minute gate changes. Stress had clearly taken its toll, and when she spotted the protruding bag, it became the final straw. "Excuse me," she said sharply, addressing the justice without hesitation. "That bag needs to go all the way in. You can't leave it sticking out like that." The justice turned to face her, his expression calm and polite. Without saying a word, he reached up and pushed the bag further into the compartment, making sure it was fully secured. Satisfied with his effort, he gave her a small nod and offered a quiet apology. "My apologies," he said softly. "I didn't realize it was sticking out." For most people, that would have been the end of the matter. Problem solved, no harm done. But the flight attendant wasn't ready to let it go. Her voice grew louder, cutting through the hum of conversation around them. "You need to pay attention," she snapped, her tone dripping with irritation. "We have rules for a reason. If everyone ignored them, we'd never get anywhere." The justice blinked, taken aback by the sudden escalation. He nodded again, keeping his composure. "Understood," he replied evenly. "Thank you for pointing it out." But the flight attendant pressed on, her frustration bubbling over. "Some people think they're above the rules," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Her words carried a subtle edge, one that made several heads turn. The justice froze for a moment, unsure whether he'd heard her correctly. Was she implying what he thought she was? Before he could respond, she gestured toward the overhead compartment again, this time more forcefully. "Make sure it's fixed," she insisted, her voice rising. "Now." Her demeanor shifted noticeably, her body language tense, her gestures exaggerated. When the justice hesitated briefly, perhaps caught off guard by her intensity, she took a step closer and shoved his arm lightly as if to emphasize her point. It wasn't a hard push, but it was enough to make him stumble slightly. The movement drew gasps from a few nearby passengers who were watching the exchange unfold. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The justice steadied himself, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. He glanced at the flight attendant, then at the growing number of eyes now fixed on them. Despite the tension, he chose to remain composed. "I've already adjusted it," he said firmly but respectfully. "Is there anything else I can assist you with?" His calm response only seemed to fuel her anger. "You should have done it right the first time," she shot back, her tone laced with accusation. "Don't make excuses." By now, whispers rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. What started as a minor issue had spiraled into something far more charged. The flight attendant's behavior felt disproportionate, almost personal. And as the seconds ticked by, it became clear that this wasn't just about a bag anymore. It was about respect, authority, and how quickly things could escalate when patience wore thin. Unbeknownst to the flight attendant, the man standing before her wasn't just any passenger. Though she couldn't have known it at the time, her actions were being directed at someone whose life was dedicated to upholding fairness and justice. And while he might have chosen to handle the situation quietly, the wheels of accountability were already turning. Because unbeknownst to her, the justice had pulled out his phone during the confrontation and made a single call, one that would change the course of the entire flight. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Passengers exchanged glances, their curiosity piqued by the announcement over the intercom. The flight attendant, who just moments ago had been brimming with misplaced authority, now looked like a deer caught in headlights. Her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides and she glanced toward the cockpit as if hoping for some kind of divine intervention. But there was no escaping the reality that the situation had spiraled far beyond anything she could control. Meanwhile, the man she'd been confronting remained calm, almost eerily so. He stood quietly near his seat, his posture relaxed but alert, as though he were waiting for the next move in a game he already knew how to win. There was an unmistakable air of patience about him, a quiet confidence that seemed to say, "This isn't over yet." As the minutes ticked by, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. People whispered theories about what might happen next. Some speculated that the plane would be delayed. Others wondered if airport security would get involved. One teenager seated near the window turned to his mom and said, "Do you think they're calling the cops?" His mother shrugged, her eyes glued to the front of the plane. "I don't know," she replied softly, "but something big is definitely going down." Then, without warning, the sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin. Heads swiveled toward the source, and soon 2 uniformed federal marshals appeared at the entrance of the aircraft. They moved with purpose, their boots clicking against the floor as they made their way down the aisle. Every eye followed them, and the energy in the room shifted again, this time from anticipation to awe. When the marshals reached the row where the confrontation had taken place, they stopped and addressed the man directly. "Sir," one of them said respectfully, nodding slightly, "we've been informed of the situation. Are you all right?" The man nodded, his expression unwavering. "Yes, I'm fine," he replied evenly. "Thank you for coming." The simplicity of his response only added to the intrigue. To the untrained observer, it might have seemed like an ordinary interaction, but the weight behind it was undeniable. The marshals didn't ask questions or demand explanations. They simply positioned themselves on either side of him, creating a protective barrier between him and the rest of the cabin. It was clear to everyone that this passenger wasn't just anyone. He was someone whose presence warranted immediate attention and respect. The flight attendant watched all of this unfold with growing panic. Her earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by sheer dread. She took a hesitant step forward, stammering, Wait, what's happening? Why are they here?" One of the marshals turned to her briefly, his tone firm but professional. "Ma'am, we'll need to speak with you shortly. For now, please remain where you are." Her face flushed red and she froze mid-step, unsure whether to argue or comply. In the end, she chose the latter, retreating to her assigned spot near the galley. But even from a distance, it was obvious that she was rattled. Her hands trembled as she adjusted her uniform, and her breathing came in short, shallow bursts. Whatever sense of control she'd clung to earlier was gone, replaced by the sinking realization that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Back in the cabin, the passengers continued to buzz with excitement. Phones were out, cameras rolling as people documented every moment. A young woman in a business suit leaned over to her colleague and whispered, "Can you believe this? This is insane." Her friend nodded, wide-eyed. "Totally wild. I mean, did you see those marshals, like full-on protection detail? Who is this guy?" Others joined in, piecing together fragments of information they'd gathered online. Someone mentioned seeing him on TV during a news segment. Another recalled reading about his work in legal journals. Slowly but surely, the truth became impossible to ignore. The man standing before them wasn't just a random traveler. He was a Supreme Court justice, one of the most powerful figures in the country. The realization hit the crowd like a tidal wave. Gasps rippled through the cabin, followed by hushed exclamations of disbelief. "Oh my God, it's really him!" one man exclaimed, pointing discreetly. "I can't believe this is happening right in front of us." Beside him, a grandmother clutched her grandson's arm, whispering, "You're witnessing history, sweetheart. Don't forget this day." Amid the chaos, the justice remained unfazed. He exchanged a few quiet words with the marshals, his voice too low for anyone else to hear. Then, with a final glance around the cabin, he allowed himself to be escorted off the plane. As he walked down the aisle, flanked by the two officers, the passengers erupted into spontaneous applause. It started with a smattering of claps but quickly grew into a thunderous ovation, echoing through the narrow space. Some people stood up, craning their necks to catch one last glimpse of him. Others waved or called out words of encouragement. "Thank you, sir," one man shouted, his voice breaking slightly. "We support you," added a woman, tears streaming down her face. For his part, the justice acknowledged the gesture with a small smile and a nod. He didn't linger or bask in the attention. Instead, he kept moving, his focus steady as he disappeared through the exit door. Behind him, the applause continued, filling the cabin with a sense of unity and shared purpose. Once he was gone, the mood shifted once more. The initial shock gave way to anger, directed squarely at the flight attendant. Passengers began voicing their frustrations openly, no longer holding back. A middle-aged man stood up, pointing accusingly at her. "How dare you treat someone like that?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Do you even realize what you've done?" She tried to defend, herself stammering, I was just doing my job." But her words fell flat. No one was buying it anymore. Even her co-workers avoided making eye contact, clearly embarrassed by the spectacle she'd created. As the commotion continued, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to unforeseen circumstances, this flight will be delayed indefinitely. We apologize for the inconvenience and appreciate your patience while we resolve the matter." The announcement confirmed what many had suspected. The plane wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Investigators would need to board, statements would need to be taken, and protocols would need to be followed. For the passengers, this meant hours of waiting, but none of them seemed to mind. If anything, they were eager to stay and see how things played out. In the days that followed, footage of the incident would spread like wildfire across social media. Hashtags like "Justice on Board" and "The Accountability" in action trended worldwide, sparking debates about race, power dynamics, and professionalism in the aviation industry. News outlets dissected every detail, analyzing what went wrong and why. And through it all, the image of the calm, composed justice walking off the plane surrounded by federal marshals would become iconic, a symbol of dignity in the face of adversity. But for now, inside the cabin, the story was still unfolding. Passengers settled back into their seats, buzzing with adrenaline and disbelief. They had witnessed something extraordinary, a moment that blurred the lines between the ordinary and the historic. And as they waited for answers, one thing was certain: none of them would ever forget this flight. The scene inside the cabin was electric, charged with a mix of emotions, anger, disbelief, and even a strange sense of solidarity. Passengers who had been strangers just hours earlier now found themselves united by what they'd witnessed. The flight attendant, once confident in her authority, now stood isolated near the galley, visibly shaken. Her uniform, which had symbolized professionalism and control earlier, now seemed like a costume she desperately wanted to shed. She avoided eye contact with everyone, her hands trembling as she fiddled with the hem of her jacket. Meanwhile, the plane sat motionless at the gate, its engines silent. Outside, investigators from the airport security team arrived, carrying clipboards and digital recorders. They moved with precision, their presence signaling that this wasn't going to be brushed under the rug. The pilot made another announcement over the intercom, apologizing for the delay and urging passengers to remain calm. But no one needed convincing. Everyone knew this wasn't an ordinary disruption. It was something far bigger. As the investigators began questioning passengers, the mood shifted again. People who had initially been passive observers were now eager to share their side of the story. A young lawyer seated near the aisle volunteered first, recounting every detail of the confrontation. "She was completely out of line," he said firmly, his voice tinged with frustration. "He didn't do anything wrong. He fixed the issue right away, but she kept pushing him. Literally pushing him." Others nodded in agreement, chiming in with their own observations. One elderly woman described how the flight attendant's tone had escalated unnecessarily. "It was like she was looking for a fight," the woman said, shaking her head. "And when she shoved him, that was it. I couldn't believe my eyes." A mother traveling with her 2 kids added, "I've flown hundreds of times, and I've never seen anyone treated like that." It was humiliating for him, sure, but also for all of us watching. We felt powerless. Each account painted a clearer picture of what had happened, and none of them reflected well on the flight attendant. Her actions weren't just unprofessional, they were deeply personal, laced with undertones that left little room for interpretation. As more passengers spoke up, the investigators exchanged knowing glances. This wasn't just a workplace dispute, it was a potential PR nightmare for the airline. Back in the galley, the flight attendant tried to explain herself to one of the investigators, her voice cracking with emotion. "I swear, I didn't mean for it to go this far," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I was stressed and I thought he wasn't listening. I didn't know who he was, okay? I didn't." Her words trailed off, drowned out by the weight of her own guilt. Whether or not she truly understood the gravity of her actions, it was clear she regretted them now. But apologies wouldn't undo the damage. The passengers' testimonies were damning, and the video footage circulating online only reinforced their accounts. Social media users dissected every frame, highlighting moments where her behavior crossed the line. Comments poured in, ranging from outrage to calls for accountability. Outside the plane, news crews gathered at the terminal, alerted by viral posts and eyewitness accounts. Reporters interviewed passengers disembarking other flights, asking if they'd heard about the incident. Some shared secondhand details while others expressed shock and disappointment. "It's 2023, one traveler said emphatically. "We should be past this kind of behavior. This isn't just about one person, it's about systemic issues in how people are treated." The airline scrambled to respond. Within hours, executives convened an emergency meeting to assess the fallout. Calls flooded their customer service lines, many demanding answers or refunds. On Twitter, hashtags like Dasher's boycott, this airline trended alongside messages of support for the justice. The company issued a vague statement promising a thorough investigation, but it did little to quell the growing backlash. Critics accused them of being reactive rather than proactive, pointing out that incidents like this often stemmed from broader cultural problems within organizations. Inside the plane, tensions simmered as the investigation dragged on. Passengers grew restless, some complaining about missed connections or work commitments. Yet despite their frustrations, most stayed put, determined to see the process through. For many, this wasn't just about getting to their destination anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. One particularly vocal passenger, a retired teacher, stood up and addressed the group. "Listen," she said, her voice steady but passionate. "I don't care if we're stuck here for hours. What happened today was wrong, plain and simple. If we leave without making our voices heard, then nothing changes. So let's stick together and make sure this doesn't happen again." Her words resonated deeply. Applause broke out, followed by nods of approval. Even those who hadn't spoken up before joined in, sharing their thoughts and experiences. The atmosphere transformed into something almost communal, a shared commitment to holding the airline accountable. By late afternoon, the decision was made. The flight would not depart. Instead, passengers were rebooked onto other flights, with vouchers offered as compensation. While some grumbled about the inconvenience, most accepted the gesture graciously, knowing it was the least the airline could do. As they disembarked, several stopped to thank the investigators for taking the matter seriously. Others hugged each other goodbye, exchanging contact information in case follow-up interviews were needed. For the flight attendant, however, there was no reprieve. She was escorted off the plane and taken to a private office for further questioning. Her colleagues avoided looking at her, their expressions a mix of pity and embarrassment. By the end of the day, her fate was sealed. She was suspended pending a full review of her conduct. Rumors swirled about potential legal consequences, though nothing official had been announced yet. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the tarmac, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a bad day for the airline. It was a wake-up call. The incident exposed cracks in the system, revealing how easily unchecked biases and stress could escalate into something far worse. For the passengers, it was a reminder of the power of collective action. For the airline, it was a lesson in humility and an opportunity to rebuild trust. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt by the justice himself. Though he'd chosen to handle the situation with grace and restraint, his quiet dignity had sparked a movement. Strangers inspired by his composure vowed to speak up against injustice whenever they encountered it. And as he boarded a different flight later that evening, surrounded by a new set of passengers unaware of the drama he'd endured, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes, even the smallest acts of courage can ignite change. Months had passed since the incident on the plane, but its impact lingered like ripples in a pond, spreading far beyond the confines of that cramped cabin. The story didn't fade into obscurity. Instead, it became a touchstone for conversations about respect, accountability, and humanity. People kept talking about it, not just because of the drama, but because it highlighted something deeper: how small moments can reveal big truths. For the justice, life returned to its usual rhythm, or as close to usual as it could be, for someone in his position. He continued his work with the same quiet dedication that had defined his career, delivering speeches, writing opinions, and shaping laws that would affect generations to come. But this experience left its mark on him too. It wasn't just the memory of being treated poorly or the public scrutiny that followed. It was the realization of how much power one person has to inspire change, even unintentionally. He often reflected on what had happened during interviews and public appearances. When asked about the confrontation, he never dwelled on anger or bitterness. Instead, he used the moment as an opportunity to teach. In one particularly memorable speech, at a university symposium, he shared a story from his own past, a time when he was younger and working multiple jobs to make ends meet. Back then, he'd faced countless instances of disrespect and prejudice, moments that could have hardened him. But instead, he chose to rise above them, focusing on proving himself through hard work and perseverance. "I learned early on," he told the audience, his voice steady and warm, "that we all carry burdens others can't see. A little kindness goes a long way, especially in situations where tensions run high. We're human beings first. Our titles, uniforms, or roles don't define us. What defines us is how we treat each other." His words resonated deeply with listeners, many of whom nodded along, some wiping away tears. There was something profoundly relatable about his message. It wasn't about excusing bad behavior or ignoring injustice. It was about choosing empathy over hostility, understanding over judgment. And while his words were directed at everyone, they carried a special weight for those in positions of authority, reminding them of the responsibility that came with their roles. At the airline, things were slowly starting to improve, but not without effort. After the initial wave of outrage subsided, executives realized they couldn't afford to let the incident become a forgotten footnote. They rolled out sweeping reforms, investing heavily in diversity training programs and conflict resolution workshops. Managers were encouraged to lead by example, fostering a culture of mutual respect among employees. Feedback loops were created so passengers and staff alike could report issues anonymously, ensuring problems didn't fester unnoticed. Still, skepticism remained. Some critics argued that these changes were superficial, designed more to polish the airline's image than to address systemic issues. Others pointed out that similar promises had been made after previous scandals, only for old habits to resurface once the spotlight faded. But there were signs of progress too. Passengers began noticing subtle shifts, an extra smile here, a more patient explanation there. Employees reported feeling supported by supervisors who prioritized fairness over efficiency. Change wasn't immediate, but it felt genuine. For the flight attendant, the aftermath was devastating. She lost her job, her reputation tarnished by videos and headlines she couldn't escape. Friends distanced themselves, unsure how to reconcile the woman they knew with the version portrayed online. Some defended her, arguing that stress and pressure had clouded her judgment. Others believed she deserved every consequence, seeing her actions as symptomatic of larger societal problems. Either way, her life was forever changed. Yet even in her lowest moments, there were glimmers of hope. With time, she began reflecting on what had gone wrong, not to justify her behavior, but to understand it. She sought counseling, grappling with the biases and frustrations that had fueled her outburst. Slowly, painfully, she started piecing herself back together, determined to learn from her mistakes. While forgiveness from the public seemed unlikely, she found solace in small victories, like volunteering at community centers or mentoring young people entering the workforce. These acts of service helped her rebuild a sense of purpose, even if redemption felt distant. As the months turned into a year, the incident continued to shape conversations beyond the aviation industry. Schools incorporated it into lesson plans about civility and leadership. Workplace seminars referenced it as a cautionary tale about unchecked emotions and implicit bias. Social media users revisited the footage, using it as a springboard for discussions about privilege, power dynamics, and the importance of treating everyone equally. The justice himself noticed these ripple effects. During a layover at another airport, he encountered a young flight attendant eager to introduce herself. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said shyly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your story inspired me to be better, to really think about how I interact with passengers. It's easy to get caught up in the stress, but it doesn't excuse losing sight of humanity." Her words moved him. He smiled warmly, offering a few encouraging remarks before continuing on his journey. Moments like these reminded him why staying composed during the confrontation had mattered, not for his sake, but for hers and countless others like her. In the end, the incident served as both a reckoning and a reminder. It exposed flaws in systems and individuals alike, forcing difficult conversations that might otherwise have been avoided. It challenged people to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their world, and it proved that even in moments of conflict, there's always room for growth, for learning, healing, and moving forward. As the Justice walked through yet another terminal, greeted warmly by employees trained to see beyond stereotypes, he allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would still be bumps, misunderstandings, and setbacks. But progress was possible inch by inch, step by step. All it took was courage, humility, and a willingness to listen. And sometimes that was enough to turn a single moment of adversity into a catalyst for lasting change.